Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Elifasi Msomi, a name that once whispered through the valleys of Natal like a cold draft in the height of summer. We begin our journey in the year 1955, in a place where the earth is the color of dried blood, and the air carries the heavy, sweet scent of ripening sugarcane. Imagine, if you will, the Umzinto district. It is a land of undulating hills and deep, secretive ravines, where the green of the vegetation is so vibrant it feels almost oppressive. The sun hangs low and heavy in the sky, a golden weight that seems to press the very breath out of the valley. Here, in the midpoint of that year, the stillness of the countryside was about to be broken by a discovery that would haunt the region for decades to come. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of the landscape, and let the outside world fade away as we travel back to a time of long shadows and even longer silences. The landscape of the South Coast is a tapestry of contradictions. To the east, the Indian Ocean crashes against the shore with a rhythmic, hypnotic pull, a constant heartbeat of salt and spray. But as you move inland, toward the heart of the Umzinto district, the roar of the surf begins to fade, replaced by a silence that is almost tactile. In 1955, this was a world defined by the industry of the earth. The hills were covered in vast, swaying oceans of cane, their sharp, slender leaves rustling in the breeze with a sound like 1,000 hushed whispers. If you listen closely, you can hear that rustle now, a dry, papery friction that seems to follow you down the red dirt tracks. These tracks snaked through the valleys, connecting remote homesteads and labor camps, disappearing into the thickets of coastal forest where the sunlight struggles to reach the floor. It was a place of deep greens and scorched browns, where the mists of the early morning would cling to the riverbanks, refusing to burn away even as the heat of the day took hold of the hills. There is a specific kind of beauty in this part of South Africa, but in the summer of 1955, that beauty felt stagnant, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for something hidden to be revealed. It was in the heat of June, in that midpoint of the year, when the first sign of something truly dark emerged from the undergrowth. A local worker, his skin glistening with the humidity of the valley, was moving through the outskirts of a plantation near the Umzinto River. He was a man accustomed to the rhythms of the field, the predictable cycles of growth and harvest. But on this afternoon, he noticed a break in the pattern of the landscape. In a valley known for its bounty, there was a patch of earth that felt fundamentally wrong. The birds, usually so boisterous in the canopy above, had gone quiet. The only sound was the distant, metallic drone of insects, a vibrating hum that seemed to vibrate in the very back of his throat. As he moved closer, pushing aside the broad, waxy leaves of the indigenous brush, the cloying heat seemed to intensify. It carried with it a scent that was not the sweetness of sugar or the dampness of the river, but something metallic and ancient. There, partially obscured by the shadow of a low-hanging branch, lay the remains of a life cut short. The red dust of the path had settled over the scene, a fine ochre powder that blurred the lines between the earth and the evidence. The discovery was not just a body. It was a rupture in the peace of the valley. The news of the find did not travel quickly at first. In those days, information was as slow as the ox carts that moved through the mud. It seeped out like water through a crack in a stone dam, slow and inexorable, until the name of the Umzinto district became synonymous with a creeping, nameless dread. Every shadow in the cane fields began to look a little longer. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footfall on the dry grass. When the local authorities eventually arrived, their heavy boots crunching on the dry soil, they found a scene that defied the simple logic of the rural police force. This was not a crime of passion, nor was it the desperate act of a hungry thief. There was a precision to the violence, a coldness that seemed to mirror the deep, cool shadows of the nearby ravines. The victim had been left in the quiet embrace of the natal brush, the first of many to be linked to a single, devastating force that would soon be known by many names. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on that first day of the investigation, casting long, skeletal shadows across the red earth, the men on the scene felt the first prickle of what the locals already whispered about in the safety of their homes. They spoke of things that moved in the dark, of spirits that demanded blood, and of a man who claimed to walk with an invisible demon perched upon his shoulder. In the fading light of that 1955 afternoon, the lush greenery of Umzinto no longer felt like a paradise. It felt like a trap. We must pause here, in the quiet of that first discovery, to consider the weight of such a moment. How does a community reconcile the splendor of its home with the horror found within its soil? The people of the valley were used to the harshness of nature, to the sudden floods of the Mzinto River and the long, baking droughts. But this was different. This was a human darkness, masked by the tall, swaying stalks of the sugar cane and the deep blues of the distant hills. As we settle into the night, let the image of those undulating green slopes stay with you. Hear the rustle of the leaves and feel the stillness of the air. The story of Elifasi Msomi is just beginning to unfold, and as the stars begin to peer through the canopy of the South African night, we realize that the echo in the valley is not just the sound of the wind. It is the beginning of a nightmare that will span 15 lives and 18 months of terror. For now, though, we remain in the silence, watching the shadows lengthen over the red earth of Umzinto, waiting for the moon to rise. The valleys of KwaZulu-Natal do not surrender their secrets easily. In the mid-1950s, the Umkomaas and Umzimkhulu regions were a sprawling labyrinth of emerald hills, deep, shadowed gorges, and mist that clung to the earth like a damp shroud. It was a landscape of profound beauty, yet by the late months of 1953, that beauty had begun to sour. A heavy, suffocating silence had descended over the kraals. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, one where even the insects seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of a coming strike. The local authorities, initially dealing with reports of isolated disappearances, were beginning to realize that the rhythm of life in the valley had been disrupted by something methodical and infinitely more patient than a common thief. There were whispers in the tall grass, carried from one homestead to the next, of a figure who moved through the brush with the grace of a ghost, a man who claimed to be a healer but left only broken things in his wake. The transition from concern to outright terror began with the discovery of the bodies. Sergeant Murr, a man whose boots were permanently stained with the red, iron-rich mud of the province, found himself standing at the edge of a remote clearing where the earth had been disturbed. The air there was thick, smelling of crushed vegetation and the metallic tang of old blood. It was here that the pattern first revealed its jagged edges. The victims were not just killed, they were harvested. In one instance, a husband and wife were found within their own dwelling, the domestic peace of their home shattered by a violence so sudden it seemed impossible for a single man to have inflicted it. The weapon used left unmistakable signatures, heavy, cleaving blows that spoke of a woodcutter's tool, an axe that had been turned from a symbol of labor into an instrument of absolute finality. As Murr knelt in the dirt, the slow drip of rain from the thatched roof above was the only sound in the stagnant air. He began to count the similarities, the way the victims were positioned, and the strange, lingering sense that the killer had lingered there, perhaps enjoying the stillness that followed the chaos. Word of the axe killer spread through the valleys like a slow-moving fever. 120 police officers were eventually mobilized, a massive force for such a rural expanse, yet they felt small against the backdrop of the undulating hills. They moved in long lines through the sugar cane fields and the thickets, their uniforms becoming soaked with sweat and rain, their eyes searching for a flash of steel or a movement that didn't belong to the wind. But Elifasi Msomi was a master of the terrain. He knew the folds of the land, the hidden caves, and the paths that vanished during the seasonal downpours. He didn't just hide, he integrated. He would appear at a homestead under the guise of an inyanga, a traditional herbalist, or a doctor. He spoke with a soft, convincing authority, his eyes bright with an intelligence that the later psychological reports would describe as being far above the average. He would offer remedies, or perhaps a blessing, drawing the families into a false sense of security before the shadow of the axe fell. This betrayal of trust was a specific kind of cruelty, a slow poisoning of the very traditions meant to protect the community. The investigation was a grueling exercise in patience. Every morning, the sun would rise over the Indian Ocean, casting long, golden fingers across the natal interior, and every morning, the detectives would regroup to compare notes on the latest missing persons. There was a young woman named Olivia Combula who had vanished, and later, news reached the authorities of a mistress who had seen something so horrific she had fled in a state of near catatonia. She spoke of a bottle, a small glass vessel that Msomi carried with him, containing a dark, viscous liquid that he claimed was the source of his vitality. He told her it was the blood of those who had been taken, a sacrifice demanded by the entity that sat upon his shoulder. This was the first time the name of the Takalosh was spoken in the context of the crimes. In Zulu folklore, the Takalosh is a mischievous, often malevolent spirit, but Msomi had turned the legend into a living nightmare. He claimed that this creature, invisible to all but him, whispered instructions into his ear, guiding his hand and providing him with the strength to evade his pursuers. The detectives, men of facts and fingerprints, found themselves battling not just a murderer, but a pervasive, ancient fear that gripped the hearts of the witnesses. As the 18-month spree continued, the pressure on the police grew to a breaking point. The number of victims had climbed to 15, ranging from grown men to defenseless children. Each new discovery was a weight on Sergeant Murr's shoulders. He spent nights in flickering lamplight, staring at maps of the Umkomaas Valley, trying to predict where the axe killer would strike next. The pattern was there, but it was erratic, like the movements of a predator that knows it is being watched. Msomi had been caught once, a brief moment of success for the law, but he had slipped away with an ease that only reinforced the supernatural aura surrounding him. He credited his escape to the Takalosh, claiming the spirit had turned him invisible or unlocked the bars of his cell. While the police searched for a physical man, the people of the valley began to look for shadows that moved against the light. They barred their doors with heavy timber and kept their fires burning late into the night, listening to the rustle of the leaves and wondering if the next sound they heard would be the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who believed he was no longer human, but a conduit for something much older and darker. From the young to the elderly, the terror had no boundaries. But as the investigation deepened, a new and far more unsettling shadow began to stretch across the green hills of Natal. It was not just the fear of a man with an axe, but the fear of what that man claimed was standing right beside him. In the small, smoke-filled huts and the quiet colonial outposts, a word began to pass from lip to lip, carried on the damp evening breeze like a contagion. The word was Takalosh. For those who did not grow up in the shadows of these valleys, the name might sound like a folk tale, but for the people of the Umzimkulu, it was as real as the red clay beneath their fingernails and the heavy heat of the summer sun. It was an ancient dread, revitalized by contemporary blood. The Takalosh is described in Zulu folklore as a creature of immense malice, a dwarf-like being, often hairy and hideously deformed, who serves those who seek to do harm. It is a spirit that can become invisible by swallowing a small stone or drinking water, allowing it to slip through locked doors and barred windows. For generations, families had raised their beds on stacks of bricks, several inches off the floor, believing the creature could only reach those who slept low to the earth. They sought to outdistance the reach of a spirit that thrived on the vulnerability of the night. But as Elifasi Msomi began to speak to the authorities, he claimed that no bricks could have saved his victims. He described a presence that did not merely lurk in the corners of a room, but one that actively directed his hand, whispering commands that he lacked the will to ignore. Msomi's narrative began not with a desire for violence, but with a search for success. He told of a time when he was a struggling herbal doctor, and in Nyanga, unable to attract the clients he needed to survive. In his desperation, he sought the counsel of another Sangoma, hoping for a charm or a medicine that would turn his fortunes. It was during this meeting, he claimed, that the bargain was struck. He didn't find a cure for his poverty. Instead, he found a master. He described how the malevolent spirit latched onto him, a pale, flickering entity that only he could see. It promised him power, but the price was steep. It demanded the life force of others. Msomi spoke of this spirit not as a hallucination, but as a constant, breathing companion that sat upon his shoulder, its weight a physical burden that never truly left him, even in his moments of deepest isolation. As the news of his claims spread, the atmosphere in the valleys changed. The mundane horror of a serial killer was replaced by a metaphysical crisis. When Msomi was first captured and subsequently escaped, the rumors reached a fever pitch. He had been locked away, yet the bars had seemingly failed to hold him. To the police, it was a lapse in security, a moment of negligence or a clever ruse. To the community, it was proof. They believed the Takalosh had reached through the iron and the stone, pulling Msomi back into the shadows so that the killing could continue. Each time he vanished from custody, the myth grew larger than the man. People began to look at the rustling of the sugarcane fields or the sudden chill in a midday breeze as signs of the unseen accomplice. The air felt heavy with the collective weight of 1,000 held breaths. The details Msomi provided were chillingly specific. He spoke of a small bottle he carried, intended to hold the blood of a young woman named Olivia Combula. He believed, or was told by the voice in his ear, that this blood was a vessel for the power he had been promised. When the police eventually recovered his items, they found more than just the tools of a murderer. They found the stolen possessions of the dead, items that Msomi kept not for their value, but as trophies for the spirit he served. The community's reaction was one of profound spiritual unrest. This was not a crime that could be solved with handcuffs alone. The local chiefs and elders watched the proceedings with a grim intensity, recognizing that if Msomi's story was true, the danger would not end even if the man himself were to be silenced by the law. The psychological profiles would later suggest that Msomi was a man of high intelligence, a manipulator who used the deeply held beliefs of his culture to mask a more human, albeit more monstrous, sadism. But for those living through the 1950s in the Natal Valleys, the logic of a psychologist offered little comfort. To them, the axe was real, the blood was real, and the whispers in the dark were the most real of all. They saw a man who walked with a shadow that was not his own. The terror was a thick, cloying thing that settled over the rooftops like the morning mist, refusing to dissipate. As the sun set each evening, the valleys fell into a silence so profound it felt like a prayer. They were waiting to see if the law of the land could truly conquer a force that claimed to belong to the world of the unseen. The investigation was no longer just a hunt for a killer. It was an attempt to prove that the light of justice could reach into the darkest corners of the human soul, where the monsters we create and the monsters we fear become one and the same. Every creak of a floorboard, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, became a reminder that the world is much larger and much stranger than we often care to admit. In the quiet of the night, the line between the physical and the spiritual began to blur, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of the tragedy that had already been written in the soil of the valley. In the humid, rolling hills of the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands, the mid-1950s arrived with a peculiar stillness that seemed to cling to the valleys of the Umkomaas and Umzimkhulu rivers. The air there often feels heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, lingering smoke of cooking fires that rise from the clusters of homesteads tucked into the green slopes. It was into this landscape of ancient traditions and quiet rhythms that a man named Elifasi Msomi began to weave a shadow longer and darker than the mountains themselves. To the villagers who first encountered him, he was not yet the name that would eventually inspire terror in the hearts of thousands. He was simply a traveler, a man who moved with a certain deliberate grace through the tall, golden grasses, appearing in the doorways of remote huts just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Msomi had been born into a lineage of tradition, having been trained as an Nyanga, a traditional herbalist, by his father. For many years, he had tried to maintain the family practice, surrounded by the dried roots, the clay pots of infusions, and the rhythmic shaking of bones that defined his craft. But by 1952, the world seemed to be narrowing for him. His patients were fewer, and the respect he craved felt increasingly out of reach. In the quiet of his hut, as the flickering light of a single tallow candle cast long, dancing shapes against the walls, Msomi began to feel a profound sense of failure. He was a man of high intelligence, sharp and observant, yet he found himself struggling to survive. It was this desperation that led him to seek professional assistance from another Sangoma, a journey that he would later claim changed the very architecture of his soul. He would tell the authorities later, in a voice as calm as a morning breeze, that during this meeting with the other healer, something shifted. He spoke of an evil spirit, a takalosh, that had co-opted his will. Imagine the scene in that dim room, the air thick with incense and the sound of distant drums, where Msomi claimed a dwarf-like entity began to whisper instructions directly into his ear. He described this spirit as a constant companion, a presence that sat upon his shoulder and guided his hand. Whether this was a genuine belief or a masterful manipulation of cultural fears, the behavior of Elifasi Msomi began to transform. He started to wander far from his home, appearing in villages like a ghost. He no longer looked like a struggling herbalist. Sometimes he arrived on horseback, leading a second animal, posing as a wealthy man from Richmond looking for a bride or a new community to serve. The villagers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. He was charismatic, able to win the favor of headmen and elders with his polite speech and his offers of employment for the local youth. Yet there was something in his eyes, a stillness that did not match his jovial words. He would sit by the fires, his hands resting on his knees, and talk for hours about the spirits and the shadows. He spoke of the takalosh as if it were a dear friend, often making space beside him on a sleeping mat for an invisible guest. In the small hours of the night, while the rest of the village slept under the protection of their ancestors, Msomi would be seen walking the perimeter of the huts, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight, whispering to the air as if answering a voice only he could hear. This was the period when the first reports of strange occurrences began to ripple through the valley. Small items would go missing, a beaded necklace here, a copper coin there. These were the trivial thefts of a man testing the boundaries of his surroundings. But there were deeper shadows, too. Rumors of a man with an axe, seen near the riverbanks where the women washed clothes, began to take hold. One woman reported seeing him standing perfectly still among the reeds for an hour, his gaze fixed on nothing at all. He had a way of disappearing just as the mist rolled in, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of his pipe tobacco and a feeling of profound cold. The community, deeply rooted in their faith and their understanding of the spirit world, found themselves grappling with a darkness they could not quite name, as Msomi continued his 18-month journey through the hills. The identification of Elifasi Msomi as a threat did not come from a grand revelation, but from the mundane reality of petty crime. In late 1955, he was stopped by the police for the possession of stolen goods. As the officers sifted through his meager belongings, they found items that were far more significant than simple trinkets. There were pieces of clothing and personal effects that belonged to people who had vanished from the surrounding valleys. When they looked into his eyes, they did not see a common thief, but a man who seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the weight of his invisible friend had finally become too heavy to bear alone. He began to speak then, a confession that would eventually link him to 15 lives lost. The man from the shadows was stepping into the light, and the truth he brought with him was more terrifying than any folklore. The blade of a heavy axe carries a specific resonance when it is honed against a coarse whetstone in the quiet of a rural evening. It is a rhythmic, metal-on-stone scrape that echoes through the stillness of a workshop or a moonlit yard. For Elifasi Msomi, this sound was not merely a chore but a prelude to a darker symphony. The tool itself was a common implement of the 1950s South African household, used for clearing brush. But in his grip, it was transformed into a vessel of terrifying intent. He chose the axe for its efficiency, an extension of strength that required no complicated mechanics in the deep shadows of the valley floor today. His method of selection was as calculated as it was cruel, often relying on the trust inherent in the desperate. Posing as a healer or a doctor of sorts, Msomi would weave a web of charm around those he met in the Umkomaas and Umzimkhulu valleys. He promised cures for the spirit and remedies for the flesh, luring his victims away from the safety of their kraals and into the isolated folds of the landscape. There is a particular horror in the image of a person walking willingly beside their executioner, discussing their hopes for health while the sun dips. They would follow him into the dense bushveld, where the tall grasses muffled his footsteps. When the moment arrived, the violence was sudden and absolute, often occurring under the pale, indifferent eye of a rising moon. Msomi did not strike with the chaotic frenzy of a novice, but with a deliberate, haunting precision that left 15 souls scattered across the red earth over 18 months. In one chilling instance, he compelled a companion to witness the act, as if the presence of an observer validated the demands of the spirit he claimed to serve. The collection of blood in a bottle was more than a ritual. It was a physical manifestation of his descent. The moonlight would catch the silver edge of the hatchet as it fell quietly onto the ground. The detectives of the 1950s faced a landscape that was as much an adversary as the killer himself. In the rural stretches of Natal, the police were met not with high-resolution tools or rapid communication, but with the raw and unforgiving elements of the wild. When a crime was eventually discovered, investigators often had to navigate miles of undulating hills and treacherous tracks, arriving long after the trail had gone cold. The heat of the African sun and the sudden, torrential summer rains acted as natural erasers, scrubbing away the fragile prints of a predator. A footprint in the soft mud might be washed into a blurry indentation within a single hour. Inside the dwellings where the tragedies unfolded, the challenges of evidence collection were immense and frustrating. Fingerprint powder was a rare luxury of the distant cities, and even when applied by lantern light, it struggled to cling to the rough, porous surfaces of hand-hewn timber or sun-baked clay. There was no genetic mapping to identify the stains upon the floor, only the crude classification of blood types that could barely narrow a search. The investigators would kneel in the dimness, holding flickering lamps that hissed in the humidity, trying to reconstruct the final moments of the deceased by the angle of a blow. Each scene was a puzzle, with many missing pieces that night. As the investigation stalled in the face of these forensic vacuums, it was not a grand scientific breakthrough that eventually unraveled the mystery, but the mundane reality of human greed. The items Msomi took from his victims, trinkets of little value to anyone but their owners, would become the physical anchors that tied him to the killings. In a world where spirits were blamed for the shadows, the tangible presence of a stolen watch or a pocket knife in a suspect's possession spoke louder than any supernatural claim. The police continued their slow patrol through the darkness, unaware that the man with the axe was already leaving a trail of small objects across the red dust. The valleys of Natal remained silent witnesses to these events, the landscape itself holding onto the memories of those 18 months of terror. While the legal system struggled to catch up with the brutality of the axe killer, the cultural fear of the Takalosh created a unique psychological barrier for those tasked with finding the truth. Each piece of evidence, from a stained garment to a misplaced tool, was a fragment of a larger story that local residents were often too terrified to tell. As the 1950s moved slowly toward their conclusion, the weight of 15 lost lives pressed heavily upon the conscience of the region, waiting for the moment when the man in the shadows would finally step into the light once more. The Umkamaz Valley in the early 1950s was a landscape of deep, humid secrets. The hills rose like the green, folded skin of an ancient animal, and the mist didn't just sit in the hollows. It lived there. It was a place where the sound of the river was a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate within the very earth. The air was thick, carrying the heavy scent of crushed grass and the metallic tang of oncoming rain. If you were to walk the narrow, red dirt paths at dusk, you would feel the weight of the silence. It was a silence that felt expectant, as if the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. This was the world of Elifasi Msomi, a man who would soon turn the quiet beauty of the Natal province into a theater of profound and lingering terror. Before he was known as the Axe Killer, Msomi was a man of medicine, a Sangoma who commanded a certain quiet respect. Among those who knew him was a woman named Ngongolwana Zaka. To her, he initially appeared not as a monster, but as a man of unusual intelligence and charisma. He had a way of speaking that was both soothing and authoritative, his voice like the slow movement of dark water over smooth stones. But there was a coldness in his eyes that didn't match his smile, a glassy, distant look that suggested his mind was always somewhere else, perhaps in conversation with things that had no names. Ngongolwana followed him into the heart of the valley in August 1953, unaware that she was about to witness the birth of a legend that would haunt South Africa for decades to come. The transformation happened under the canopy of the forest, away from the eyes of the village. It was there that Ngongolwana witnessed the first shadow of the nightmare. Msomi had lured a young woman named Olivia Combula into the woods. The air grew suddenly cold, the kind of chill that sinks through the skin and settles in the marrow. With a terrifying, methodical slowness, Msomi turned his attention to Olivia. There was no heat of passion in his movements, only a clinical, ritualistic focus. When the act was done, he did something that chilled Ngongolwana to her soul. He collected the lifeblood of the girl in a glass bottle, holding it up to the failing light as if it were a precious elixir. He told Ngongolwana that this was necessary, a requirement for the power he was building and the spirit he served. It was during these moments that Msomi began to speak of his companion. He claimed that an entity, a Takalosh, was perched upon his shoulder. He would tilt his head to the side, his ear toward the empty air, nodding as if receiving instructions from a whispered voice. To an outsider, he looked like a man lost in a private madness, but to those caught in his orbit, the presence felt suffocatingly real. He described the creature as an elf-like demon that demanded obedience and blood. In his mind, he was no longer a lone man committing atrocities. He was a vessel, a tool being wielded by a supernatural force. This belief gave him a terrifying sense of calm, a detached certainty that made his presence feel like a physical weight in the small huts and forest clearings where he moved and waited. For 2 weeks after that first murder, Ngongolwana lived in a state of suspended animation, a survival mode that blurred the days into a single, long shadow. She traveled with him, a silent witness to his descent. Msomi treated her with a strange, domestic normalcy that was perhaps more frightening than his outbursts of violence. He would sit by the fire and discuss his plans, his voice calm and steady, while the bottle of blood sat nearby like a grim talisman. He seemed to derive a dark pleasure from her fear, a slow-burning satisfaction that the psychologists would later identify as a core part of his psyche. He was a man who understood the architecture of terror, building it brick by brick in the minds of those who were forced to watch his work as they moved through the dense valley together. Eventually, the bond of fear broke. Ngongolwana found her opening and fled to the authorities, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She spoke of the axe, the bottle, and the invisible demon that rode on Msomi's shoulder. Her story was so fantastic, so steeped in the occult that it seemed impossible, yet the conviction in her eyes told a different story. The police began their search, but the valley was vast. This was the first encounter, the moment the mask slipped and revealed the void beneath. The terror had begun its 18-month march through the Natal valleys, and the name Elifasi Msomi would soon become a whisper used to frighten children into silence as the sun began to set behind the jagged mountains of the Natal interior. The air in the Umkamaz Valley does not just sit, it weighs. It is a thick, amber presence carrying the scent of baked earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the red dust defining this corner of the world. After Ngongolwana broke her silence, the hunt shifted from disjointed whispers into a focused, desperate campaign. The red dust, kicked up by the boots of searching officers, coated everything: their tongues, their eyelashes, the very pages of their notebooks. It was as if the landscape was trying to swallow the evidence, burying the truth beneath layers of ancient, sun-scorched soil. Every morning, the sun rose over the jagged peaks like a blooming bruise, illuminating a wilderness as vast as it was indifferent to the blood spilled within its folds. The silence that followed her escape was a long, heavy holding breath, waiting for the first sign of a man who had become a ghost. 120 men. That was the scale of the net cast across the valleys in the mid-1950s. They were not merely searching for a common criminal. They were hunting a shadow that navigated the Umzimkulu brush with the ease of a leopard. The local constabulary felt the eyes of the world upon them, a heavy, unblinking gaze demanding an end to the 18 months of terror. Officers moved in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the dry ground, searching for a broken twig or a faint impression in the fine silt. The pressure from superiors in the distant cities was a constant hum, a reminder that with every day the killer remained free, the legend of his supernatural protection grew stronger in the hearts of the populace. It was an immense, administrative weight that felt heavier than the service revolvers at their hips. The search parties moved with deliberate, agonizing slowness through the undulating ribs of the valley. Every step was a gamble against the rising heat. They combed through the tall, golden grass that hissed against their trousers, a sound like 1,000 whispered secrets. The terrain was a labyrinth of hidden pockets and shadowed kloofs where the air remained stagnant and cool even at noon. They searched the riverbeds, where the mud had dried into cracked patterns like the scales of a great serpent, and the rocky outcrops where vultures circled with patient interest. The sound of the wind groaning through the thorn trees was the only companion for hours, a lonely, hollow noise that made the men tighten their grip on their rifles and glance toward the ridges. They were looking for a monster hidden in the shimmering heat, a man who seemed to dissolve whenever they drew near. Beyond the physical toll, there was a psychological layer the officers could not ignore. The local villages were silent, a heavy, watchful silence born of a fear that no police badge could soothe. To many, Elifasi Msomi was not just a murderer. He was a conduit for the Takalosh, the malevolent spirit that supposedly rode upon his shoulder and whispered the names of his next victims. This belief made every interview a challenge. Information was offered in fragments, or not at all, as the people feared the spirit would see them talking and visit their huts in the night. The detectives had to navigate this spiritual minefield, trying to separate the tangible tracks of a human being from the spectral myths that clouded the trail like a heavy morning mist. It was an exhausting, ethereal hunt that tested their resolve and their reason. Then came the dead ends, the cruelest part of any hunt. A frantic report would arrive from a village 30 miles to the north, claiming a tall man with a shadowed face had been seen near the cattle pens. The officers would ride out, horses lathered in white sweat, hearts pounding with hope and dread, only to find a confused laborer or a traveler who bore no resemblance to the man they sought. They investigated abandoned shacks and caves, where the floor was littered with the bones of small animals, finding nothing but the cold ash of fires that had died out years ago. Each false lead was a slow erosion of the men's spirits, a reminder that the killer was always one step ahead, vanishing into the dust before the law could close its hand. The hunt continued endlessly through the brush, each day adding to the growing tally of failure. Night offered no reprieve, only a different kind of tension. As the lanterns were lit in the camps, the officers would sit in the flickering orange glow, cleaning the grit from their revolvers and speaking in low voices about the sheer vastness of the natal wilderness. The maps spread out on the tables were crisscrossed with red ink, marking where they had been and where they had failed to find him. It felt as though they were searching for a single grain of sand in a desert of blood. The frustration was a palpable thing, a thick fog that settled over the tents as the stars came out. They knew he was out there, moving through the darkness with a familiarity they could never match, while the trail of red dust waited for the one mistake that would finally bring the long nightmare to an end. The Umkamaz Valley is a place where the earth seems to breathe with a heavy, rhythmic sigh. In the mid-1950s, this vast expanse of green and shadow became a labyrinth for a man who claimed to be more than human. Elifasi Msomi did not merely walk through these hills, he dissolved into them. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the air would grow thick with a damp, clinging mist that swallowed the cattle paths and the winding riverbanks. You can almost feel the chill on your skin, the way the moisture clings to the tall tambuti grass, turning every blade into a silver needle under the moonlight. For the villagers living in the small homesteads scattered across the valley, the night was no longer a time for rest. It had become a living, breathing entity of fear. They knew he was out there, somewhere in the darkness, moving with a silent, practiced ease that defied the heavy-footed efforts of the colonial police force. Every rustle of a dry leaf, every snap of a twig in the distance, was no longer just the wind or a wandering goat. It was the potential presence of the axe killer. The psychological toll on these communities was profound and paralyzing. Imagine the interior of a traditional rondavel during those long 18 months of terror. The smell of wood smoke lingers in the thatch, but tonight the fire is kept low, a guttering amber eye in the center of the room. The residents would sit in a heavy, stifling silence, their ears tuned to the world outside. They began to reinforce their homes in ways they never had before. The sound of a heavy wooden bar sliding into place against a door became the final prayer of the evening, a dry, scraping sound of wood on wood that offered only a thin illusion of safety. They were not just hiding from a man, they were hiding from a legend. Msomi had already escaped police custody twice, and word had spread like a fever through the valleys that he was aided by a Takalosh. This dwarf-like spirit was said to make him invisible, to allow him to slip through locked doors and walk past sleeping guards without waking a single soul. To the people of Natal, he was not just a fugitive. He was a ghost with a blade. While the police were scouring the deep ravines and setting up lanterns in their camps, Msomi was often hiding in plain sight. He was a master of the mask. In the daylight, witnesses would later describe him as a jovial man, a normal and kindly presence who could win over a village headman with a smile and a respectful greeting. He would present himself as a traveling Inyanga, a traditional healer seeking a new community to serve. Think of the chilling intimacy of that deception. He would sit by their fires, eat their food, and sleep under their roofs, all while the blood of his previous victims was barely dry on his tools. He used the very culture of hospitality that defined the Zulu people as a weapon against them. He would offer his services, promising to heal the sick or bring good fortune, while the invisible weight of the Takalosh supposedly sat upon his shoulder, whispering of the next sacrifice. The contrast between his public warmth and his private depravity created a vacuum of trust that would take decades to heal. His flight was not a desperate scramble for survival, but a calculated, slow-motion journey through the landscape of human vulnerability. He moved between the Umkamas and Umzimkulu valleys, covering miles of treacherous terrain with a lightness that seemed supernatural to those chasing him. The police officers, tired and frustrated, found themselves shadowboxing. They would arrive at a kraal only to find that a man matching his description had departed just hours before, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of unease and a few stolen items of clothing. Msomi had a strange habit of taking the clothes of his victims and gifting them to others, a macabre cycle of recycling the identities of the dead to buy the silence of the living. Each garment carried a history of violence, yet they were worn by unsuspecting people who simply saw a generous traveler. The texture of the fabric, the familiar scent of wood smoke on a donated shirt, these were the mundane details that masked the monster in their midst. As the weeks stretched into months, the atmosphere in the valleys became one of collective exhaustion. Sleep was a luxury that few could afford. When the sun rose, it brought only a brief reprieve, a few hours to work the fields before the shadows began to lengthen once more. The residents lived in a state of hypervigilance, their eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines for a solitary figure. The psychological weight of knowing that doors were no longer barriers, and that the man they feared might already be inside their circle, was a burden that distorted reality. Some claimed to see the Takalosh in the corner of their eyes, a small, dark shape darting behind a grain bin or a flicker of movement in the thatch. Fear has a way of manifesting the very things we dread. For the authorities, the pressure was mounting. They were being outmaneuvered not by a military genius, but by a man who understood the power of shadow and the deep-seated beliefs of his people. He was playing a game with the entire province, and for a long time, it seemed as though he was winning. The fugitive's flight was eventually destined to falter, but not because of a grand, tactical breakthrough. It would be the smallest of mistakes, a lapse into the mundane habits of a petty criminal, that would finally snag the hem of his invisibility cloak. But during this period of evasion, Elifasi Msomi was a king of the wilderness. He moved through the valleys like the summer storms that roll across the Drakensberg, sudden, violent, and leaving behind a world changed by terror. As we listen to the quiet night around us now, it is easy to forget how thin the walls of a home can feel when the person outside believes he is a spirit. The locks on the doors in 1955 were never meant to keep out a nightmare that could smile at you in the morning and take everything by the light of the moon. For now, the valley remains dark, the river continues its low murmur, and the ghost of the axe killer still walks the perimeter of our thoughts, waiting for the moment when the light finally catches his true face. See in Judgment. In the humid, heavy air of 1955, the hunt for the man they called the axe killer had become a weight upon the soul of the natal province. 120 police officers moved through the valleys like a slow, sweeping tide, their boots caked in the thick, red clay of the South African landscape. They looked for a monster, a shadow dweller who claimed to be guided by a malevolent spirit. Yet, Elifasi Msomi was no longer a shadow. He had attempted to dissolve into the mundane rhythms of the earth, taking a job as a simple farm laborer in the district of Umzinto. Here, among the endless rows of sugar cane and the ripening crops, he sought to bury the blood-stained reputation of a shaman under the identity of a quiet worker. He lived in a modest room provided by the farm, a small space where he hoped the silence of the countryside would swallow his past. The seasons were shifting, and in May of that year, the skies over Umzinto finally broke. A steady, rhythmic rain began to fall, turning the dust of the farm into a deep, clinging mire. It was the kind of rain that muffled the world, turning every conversation into a whisper and every movement into a labor. In this damp stillness, the smallest of human actions became amplified. On this particular morning, the farm foreman noticed something was amiss. It was not a body in the grass or a scream in the night that alerted him, but rather the empty patches in the earth where the sweet potatoes should have been. A portion of the day's harvest had vanished under the cover of the rain. In the grand narrative of a serial killer, it seems almost poetic that the terror of 15 souls would be undone by something as humble as a stolen crop. Yet it was this petty theft that would serve as the final thread in the tapestry of his undoing. The foreman was a man of the land, observant and patient. He looked down at the soft, wet earth and saw what the rain had preserved rather than washed away. There, pressed into the mud, were the clear, fresh imprints of a pair of feet. Each footprint was a heavy, distinct mark of a man walking with a burden. The foreman followed them. He moved slowly, his own breath visible in the cool, moist air, as the tracks led him away from the fields and toward the laborers' quarters. There was no haste in his step, only the quiet determination of a man seeking to resolve a minor grievance. He followed the trail past the storage sheds and the tools, watching as the footprints grew clearer, more deliberate, until they stopped abruptly at a single door. It was the door to the room where Elifasi Msomi was resting, unaware that the earth itself had betrayed his presence. When the foreman knocked, the sound was flat and dull against the wood. Inside the room, Msomi sat in the dim light. He denied the theft at first, his voice steady, perhaps still believing in the invincibility his invisible companion had once promised him. But the foreman was persistent, his eyes scanning the small room until they landed on the evidence of the crime. The sweet potatoes were there, a humble stash hidden away. But as the room was searched more thoroughly, other items began to emerge from the shadows. There were trinkets and pieces of clothing, things that did not belong to a farmhand earning a meager wage. These were the quiet echoes of his victims, small personal belongings that he had kept like macabre souvenirs. The foreman, realizing this was more than a simple matter of a stolen harvest, sent word for the authorities. The net, which had been cast so wide and so fruitlessly for 18 months, was finally beginning to tighten around a single, unremarkable room. The police arrived as the rain began to taper off into a fine mist. They did not come with the roar of engines or the shouting of orders. Instead, they moved with a calculated, heavy caution, surrounding the small dwelling as the afternoon light began to fail. There was a profound tension in the air, a collective holding of breath. The officers expected a confrontation with a man of supernatural strength, a killer who had twice slipped through the fingers of the law like smoke. They prepared for a struggle that would match the brutality of the crimes they had investigated. But as they closed in, the atmosphere changed. The frantic energy that had sustained Msomi's flight seemed to evaporate. There was no axe raised in defiance, no desperate leap for freedom. The officers found a man who looked tired, a man whose eyes seemed to reflect a sudden, crushing emptiness. The supernatural aura he had cultivated was gone, replaced by the stark reality of a fugitive who had reached the end of his path. When the handcuffs finally clicked shut, the sound was surprisingly quiet. It was a metallic final note that signaled the end of the terror. Msomi offered no resistance. He stood up and walked with the officers, his head bowed, stepping over the very mud that had led them to him. He would later tell the investigators that the spirit, the takalosh that had whispered in his ear for so long, had finally departed. He claimed that the creature had bathed with him in the river one last time and then vanished, leaving him alone to face the consequences of their shared darkness. As the police vehicle pulled away from the farm at Mzinto, the laborers watched in silence. The man who had sought to hide in the dirt was now bound for a cell, leaving behind the fields and the rain. The long hunt was over, and the quiet of the night began to settle over the valleys once more, though the memories of what had been lost would remain etched into the soil forever. The room where Elifasi Msomi sat was a cramped, airless pocket of the world, tucked away within the heavy stone walls of the police station. It was the year 1955, and outside, the humid air of the natal valleys was thick with the approach of a storm. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a clock on the wall, each second falling like a drop of water into a deep well. The light from a single, naked bulb overhead cast long, trembling shadows that seemed to dance against the peeling paint of the walls. In the center of this world sat Msomi. He was a man of average height, yet in the stillness of the interrogation, he seemed to occupy more space than a person should. There was a profound, unsettling calm about him. His hands, which had carried out 15 terrible acts over the previous 18 months, were now folded neatly on the wooden table. They did not tremble. They did not fidget. They simply rested there, as if the man they belonged to was a mere spectator to the events that had brought him here. The detectives across from him watched in a silence that was heavy with exhaustion and a growing sense of dread. They had seen many men broken by the weight of their crimes, men who wept or lied or raged. But Msomi was different. When he finally began to speak, his voice was not the harsh growl of a killer, but a soft, melodic murmur that pulled the listeners into a story that defied the logic of the modern world. He did not speak of anger. He did not speak of greed. Instead, he spoke of a shadow that had entered his life 2 years prior, in 1953. He explained that he had been a struggling Sangoma, a traditional healer, searching for the power to help others. In his desperation, he had consulted another shaman, and it was during that fateful meeting that something had latched onto him. He described it with such vivid, sensory detail that the officers felt a chill creep up their spines despite the heat of the room. He spoke the word that every person in the room knew from the folklore of the Zulu people, a takalosh. It was not a myth to Msomi, but a living, breathing entity that had become his constant companion. He described how the creature would manifest, a small, dwarf-like figure with skin like weathered leather and eyes that burned with a malevolent light. It did not stand before him like a common man. It would perch, he claimed, directly upon his shoulder. He described the weight of it, a heavy, cold pressure that never left him. The detectives scratched their pencils across yellowed paper, recording his words as he explained that the spirit would lean in close, its breath smelling of stagnant water and old earth, and whisper instructions directly into his ear. It was this spirit, Msomi insisted, that had demanded the blood of 15 victims. He claimed he was nothing more than a puppet, a physical vessel for a darkness that belonged to another realm entirely. As the hours ticked by, Msomi detailed the murders with a terrifying lack of emotion, as if he were recounting the chores of a mundane day. He spoke of the Umkamas and Umzimkulu valleys, the mist-covered places where he had led his victims. He described the specific weight of the axe in his hand, and how the spirit would urge him on, whispering that each life taken would grant him more power, more protection. He told them of one young woman whose blood he had collected in a small glass bottle, a ritual commanded by his invisible master. The detectives leaned in, their faces pale under the flickering yellow light. They were men of facts and evidence, yet here was a man who spoke of the supernatural with the conviction of a true believer. He told them that the takalosh had even helped him escape custody in the past, slipping through locks and confusing the minds of his captors. To Msomi, his crimes were not his own. They were a debt paid to a creature that owned his very soul. Even more chilling was the report from the jail cell where Msomi had spent his first nights after his final arrest. His fellow inmates told stories of him moving aside on his narrow, ragged sleeping mat in the middle of the night. They watched in silent terror as he patted the empty space beside him, whispering softly to the air. When they asked him what he was doing, he simply told them he was making room for a friend. He said the spirit was there with him, even in the heart of the prison. During the interrogation, he seemed almost relieved to be explaining this relationship. He was eager to lead the police back to the scenes of his crimes, not because he felt remorse, but because he wanted to prove the spirit's influence. He helped them find a missing skull, a grim trophy of a life extinguished under the spirit's command. Every step he took back into the valleys was done with a sense of purpose, as if he were still following a script written by something unseen. The psychologists who would later examine him struggled to reconcile his claims with his intellect. They found him to be a man of much higher than average intelligence, possessing a sharp, calculating mind that understood the consequences of his actions. They saw a man who derived a dark, sexual satisfaction from the pain he inflicted, yet Msomi never wavered from his defense. He insisted that the courts of the white men would never understand because they did not understand the Takalosh. He believed that if he were judged by the elders of the Zulu people, they would see him for what he was, a victim of a curse so powerful that no mortal will could resist it. As the confession finally came to an end, the room was silent once more. The storm outside had finally broken, and the rain began to lash against the windows with a ferocity that seemed to echo the violence of Msomi's past. He looked at the detectives, his eyes clear and calm, and waited for the next command in a life that was no longer his own. The air within the Supreme Court in Pietermaritzburg was thick, a heavy tapestry woven from the scents of old floor wax, sun-warmed mahogany, and the collective, held breath of a city in shock. It was September in the year 1955, a time when the sun hung low over the hills of Natal, casting long shadows into the corners of the room. As the proceedings began, the architecture felt designed to diminish the individual, with its high, vaulted ceilings and the stern, unyielding gaze of the law carved into dark timber. The magnitude of the 15 lives lost was a physical presence that pressed against the windows, seeking a justice that felt almost impossible to fully grasp in the gathering heat. Elifasi Msomi sat in the prisoner's dock, a figure of startling stillness amidst the legal storm. He was not the wild-eyed beast the public had imagined, but a man who appeared deeply, almost spiritually, preoccupied. Throughout the trial, he maintained a narrative that defied the cold logic of the Crown. He did not deny the blood on his hands, nor did he hide the locations of the shallow graves in the valleys of Umzimkhulu. Instead, he claimed he was merely an instrument, a vessel for a power far older and more malevolent than himself. He spoke of the Takalosh, the spirit which he claimed sat upon his shoulder, whispering instructions. To the spectators, he seemed to be making space on the bench for an invisible guest, shifting with strange courtesy. His defense of possession clashed with the court's logic. 2 prominent psychologists were called to the stand to dissect the mind of the man who claimed to be a puppet of a demon. Their testimony was perhaps the most unsettling part of the ordeal. They did not find a man suffering from the fragmented reality of insanity. Instead, they presented the court with a man of superior intelligence, a mind that functioned with a precision and a clarity that surpassed the average citizen. This created a profound paradox. How could a man with such high cognitive capacity believe he was commanded by a spirit, or was the Takalosh a mask for a darkness that the human heart is loath to name? The doctors suggested his intellect was the tool he used to manipulate his victims, a sharp blade hidden behind cultural superstition. The focus then shifted to the survivors, those rare few who had looked into the eyes of the axe killer and lived. 2 women stood before the judge, their voices thin and fragile like dry leaves in a winter wind. They spoke of the October afternoon in 1954 when the light was fading over the plantation. They described how Elifasi had approached them with a charm that felt like a warm blanket, promising work and a better life. They recounted the long walk into the deep brush, the way the silence of the forest began to feel heavy, and the sudden realization that the man leading them was a hunter. They spoke of the moment the axe was revealed, the silver flash of metal in the twilight, and the desperate, frantic scramble to escape a fate that had claimed others. The courtroom watched in a hushed silence as Elifasi listened to these accounts. There was no remorse in his expression, only a detached sort of curiosity, as if he were listening to a story about a stranger. He seemed more concerned with the invisible entity at his side than with the living victims who stood just feet away from him. This detachment was what truly unnerved the court. It was a cold distance that suggested he viewed the world as a series of tasks to be completed for his master. The prosecutors argued that his claims were a calculated attempt to avoid the gallows, a clever use of his high intelligence to exploit the cultural fears of the time. Yet, for many, the question remained. Could a man so brilliant truly be so deluded, or was he simply a genius of evil? By the time the judge reached his verdict, the sun had moved across the sky, leaving the courtroom in a cooling twilight. The weight of the 15 murders hung in the air like smoke. The law, in its finality, rejected the supernatural. It saw only the man, the axe, and the calculated path of destruction he had carved through the natal valleys. Elifasi Msomi was sentenced to death by hanging, a decision met with a mixture of relief and dread. Even as he was led away to his cell, the whispers persisted. Many believed that while the man might die, the spirit he served would remain. As the doors of the Supreme Court closed in 1956, the case left an indelible scar on the land, a reminder of the thin line between the world of reason and the shadows. The courtroom was a vessel for the cooling air of the late afternoon, with golden sunlight retreating into the high-arched shadows. As the word guilty faded, a thick silence took hold, tactile and heavy, every gaze fixed upon Elifasi Msomi, who stood framed by the polished wood of the dock. He braced himself as if against a physical wind. Justice Kennedy sat upon the high bench, his face etched with the gravity of a man holding the threads of life and death in his hand. Justice Kennedy leaned forward, his robes rustling like dry leaves. He spoke of 15 lives taken, men, women, and children whose names were now etched into the official record. He detailed the 9 counts of attempted murder and the robberies that left a trail of broken spirits. Then, the words fell into the stillness. "You shall be taken to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead." The sentence was a rhythmic tolling of a final, heavy bell that echoed through the room. In the face of this finality, Msomi remained unnervingly still. No tremor touched his hands, no flicker of panic reached his eyes. He seemed a passenger in his own body, already beyond the reach of human law. He did not ask for mercy. His calm was a chilling confirmation to the crowd of his earlier claims. He maintained he was merely a vessel for the Takalosh, the malevolent spirit he claimed commanded him. As guards moved to lead him away, he looked at the gallery with a gaze both vacant and intensely knowing, watching a world he no longer knew. The public response was a tapestry of relief and lingering terror. The spiritual fear Msomi had stoked did not simply dissipate with the verdict. In the villages, news of the death sentence was met with hushed, anxious tension. Many believed his execution might not be the end, but a transition. If he were a host for the Takalosh, would the spirit find a new home? This fear prompted a unique request. 9 Zulu chiefs petitioned to witness the hanging, a measure intended to ensure the man who had terrorized their people was truly gone, and not saved by any dark supernatural intervention from the depths of the old spirit world. The journey to the death row of Pretoria Central Prison was long and somber. Msomi was moved from the green valleys toward the cold, gray stone of the capital. Inside those walls, time behaved differently, marked by the clanging of iron and the measured footfalls of guards. He spent his final months in a small, sparse cell. Reports suggested he remained unchanged, speaking of his invisible master with a familiarity that unsettled his keepers. To the psychologists, he was a man of superior intelligence and cruelty, but to the public, he remained an inscrutable shadow that even the bright prison lights could never fully pierce. On the morning of February 10, 1956, the air in Pretoria was crisp. It was the day the state would carry out the final command. The delegation of Zulu chiefs arrived, their faces solemn. They were there to verify with their own eyes that the life had left him, to bring back word that the axe killer was dead. As the sun climbed, the ritual of the gallows commenced. The walk was short, the silence absolute. Msomi went to his death with the same eerie composure he had shown in the dock. A man welcoming the void that awaited him at the end of the rope, unmoving and silent as a stone in winter. When the trapdoor fell, the tension of 3 years finally snapped. After the official pronouncement, the chiefs were led into the chamber. They stood before the remains of the man who claimed to be a king of spirits, observing the stillness of his form. They looked for signs of the supernatural, for any trace of the dark power he invoked. Seeing only the cooling clay of a mortal man, they were satisfied. The axe was broken. Yet, as they left, some wondered if the spirit had merely retreated into the grass, waiting for a new host to wander into the moonlight, seeking secrets that should have remained buried. The case of Elifasi Msomi rests now, a dark chapter in a land where the line between the seen and the unseen is thin. The terror has faded into the soft breathing of time, though his name is still whispered when the moon is low. The law has closed the book on 15 lives lost. As the night deepens, let these details fade. The shadows are long, but you are safe. The courtroom is empty, and the valleys are at peace, dreaming in silence. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The morning of February 10, 1956, arrived with a heavy, leaden sky over Pretoria. Inside the thick stone walls of the central prison, the air was stagnant, smelling of floor wax and old iron. Every sound echoed with a strange, hollow weight. The click of a guard's heel on the concrete, the rattle of a tin cup against bars. They all seemed stretched out, lingering in the long hallways like ghosts. Elifasi Msomi sat in his cell, the space narrow and cold. The stone was damp, a permanent sweat on the walls that seemed to weep for the deeds committed in the valleys of Natal. He had spent months in this silence, a man caught between the logic of the law and the whispers of a darker world. The orange light of a single bulb overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shapes that danced across the corners of the room. It was a morning that promised nothing but the finality of an ending. To the psychologists who had studied him during the long trial, he was a man of intelligence far beyond the average, a mind that derived a terrible, hidden satisfaction from the infliction of pain. But to the public, and perhaps in his own fractured reality, he was something else, a vessel for the Takalosh. Throughout the months of 1955, he had spoken of the spirit that sat upon his shoulder, an invisible master that commanded the blade. 15 lives had been claimed by that axe between 1953 and 1955. The courts did not believe in spirits. They believed in the physical evidence of blood and stolen goods. Yet, even in the heart of a modern prison, the old fears remained thick enough to touch. The air felt heavy with the weight of 15 souls, and the silence of the cell was a pressure that never relented, a quiet that screamed of the sugar-cane fields and the lonely paths. In a moment that remains unique in the history of the gallows, a special and haunting request had been granted by the authorities. Standing in a solemn, silent line within the prison were 9 Zulu chiefs and elders. They had traveled a great distance to be here, their faces etched with the gravity of their ancestral task. They were not here as mourners, but as witnesses for their people. The community they represented was gripped by a deep, shivering terror, not just of the man himself, but of the possibility that his spirit master might pluck him from the very hands of death. They needed to see the end with their own eyes. They needed to witness the physical reality of the trapdoor and the rope, so they could return to the valleys and tell the families that the spell was broken. Their presence was a bridge between two worlds, a silent testament to the need for a visible ending. The walk from the cell to the execution chamber was slow, each step measured by the rhythmic pulse of a silent building. The air in the chamber was thin and smelled faintly of old dust and treated hemp. The rope hung with a deceptive softness, a coil of thick, braided fibers that swayed ever so slightly in an unfelt breeze. It did not look like an instrument of justice so much as a piece of rough earth suspended from the ceiling. Msomi stood upon the wooden trapdoor, the grain of the timber pressing into the soles of his bare feet. There was no sound of a spirit laughing, no invisible wings to carry him away from the gravity of his crimes. There was only the heavy, expectant silence of the 9 chiefs and the steady, mechanical preparations of the executioner. Every movement was deliberate and slow, stretching the final seconds into a long, thin wire of anticipation that vibrated in the quiet air. When the lever was finally pulled, the sound was a sharp, sudden crack that seemed to shatter the stillness of the prison morning. It was a sound of absolute finality, devoid of any magic or mystery. For a long, breathless moment, the 9 chiefs remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the empty space where the man had stood. They waited, perhaps for a sign of the supernatural, or perhaps just to be entirely sure. A medical officer stepped forward, the cold metal of a stethoscope meeting the skin to find a heart that had finally stopped its violent rhythm. The verdict was silent and absolute. The life that had been a storm of terror was now a quiet, forgotten pool. The Takalosh had not come to save its pawn. The man who had terrorized the hills was merely flesh and bone, and that flesh had reached its ultimate end. The witness was complete, and the terror began to dissolve into the gray morning. The impact of the axe killer did not fade with the morning mist. The story of Elifasi Msomi became a permanent scar on the history of the nation, a point where the rigid law of the state met the deep-seated spiritual beliefs of the land. The 9 chiefs left the prison and carried the news back to the hills, bringing a somber peace to the valleys. They spoke of the cold stone and the absolute end, ensuring that the legend of the spirit master would not sprout anew in the minds of the fearful. The shadows in the sugarcane fields grew shorter that day, and the paths became a little safer to walk. We have traveled through the darkest parts of this memory together, and now we leave the echoes of the prison behind. The lanterns are dimmed and the heavy doors are closed. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.